This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Are you sitting comfortably, ready for your digital exam? Question 1. What percentage of listening to radio is done in the car? Answer: 20%. How many cars are fitted with a digital radio? Answer: 2%. Question 3. Does anyone seriously believe that the government's target date of 2015 for switching off all non-digital network radio is remotely feasible? Later in feedback, I'll try and find out if the boss of BBC Radio is a true digital believer. And what about his ultimate boss, the likely incoming chairman of the BBC Trust, Lord Patten, whose proposed appointment was scrutinised by Parliament this week?
It would be a huge honour to help steer the BBC from the analogue to the digital age.
Just over 12 years ago, Lord Patten, as the last governor, was handing Hong Kong over to the Chinese. Schoolboy Jojo Beidou wasn't even born then, but now he's playing the lead in this week's Book at Bedtime on Radio 4.
For our reward, he gave us a big bottle of Fanta. We had a drinking race, and then we all had a big bird together, like bullfrogs having a ruckus.
But first, a first. Before Lord Patten could take up his latest appointment as chairman of the BBC Trust, he had to gain the approval of the Parliamentary Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. So they asked him to come along and be grilled. Would he be toast or toasted?
You're paid £110,000 a year for this job. Do you think you're worth it?
What will you be doing to tackle perceived bias in BBC reporting?
Everything I read about your desire for this job had the word passion. You were passionate about it. And whilst we all demonstrate passion differently, I have to say I'm not getting the passion. The only passion you've demonstrated this morning is a strange passion for Melvyn Bragg.
The hearing lasted just over 2 hours, in which we found out, among other things, that Lord Patten is a great fan of Radio 3, Melvyn Bragg and Radio 4, with which he says he wakes up and goes to bed. He also made clear there would be tough cuts to come. Afterwards, I asked Jocelyn Hay, who runs The Independent, the very independent public service lobby group Voice of the Listener and Viewer, if she'd been impressed by what had been a unique occasion.
I think between them they covered every important issue, and I thought he came through it with flying colours. It's added to the transparency, it's made the candidate think things through, and it has revealed the character of the person in public, which has probably not been apparent before.
But he made absolutely clear that no more salami slicing in the BBC, cutting small bits from existing services. He's clearly in the business about cutting back and taking out some services, doing less better. Nobody said anything about consulting the audience about what should be cut.
It's going to be very, very difficult, and he recognises the difficulties. Whatever they cut, there will be an outcry. I mean, we're very disturbed at the moment about the impact on the World Service, and it seems so short-sighted, as indeed we were about Six Music.
But obviously, for people listening to this programme, one of the things they'll be concerned about is the danger that Chris Patten and Mark Thompson of the BBC takes his decisions in private and then tells the listener and the viewer after it's made them.
But he did mention the interests of licence fee payers, which I think is important, and which the government to an extent has forgotten in using some of the licence fee now to fund services that were previously funded by government. And he also recognised the difficulty that's going to come, for instance, when one service like the World Service is pitted against another, one of the domestic services.
Yes, you'll have to be deciding to cut, perhaps, some domestic services that the licence fee payer can listen to protect the World Service, which, on the whole, the licence fee payer can't listen to.
Exactly.
That's a tough sell.
He is going to be in a very, very hot seat.
Jocelyn Hay of the Voice of the Listener and Viewer. Later on Thursday afternoon, I talked to the chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, Conservative MP John Whittingdale, in charge of the hearing. How significant was this morning's meeting of the Select Committee?
I thought it was very important. When the government originally published the list of public appointments that should be subject to this process of questioning by a select committee, the BBC chairman was left off the list. And at the time we protested and said that in many ways the chairman of the trust is one of the most important positions that should be subjected to scrutiny by a select committee, because it's highly political. It's very important that the person concerned is seen to be independent, is not just a government stooge.
But is it a real hearing? I mean, is it conceivable that you could go back and say to the Secretary of State, no, we don't think he should be appointed?
It's certainly possible. At the moment...
would he be obliged to listen to you?
Well, no, at the moment the government have said that they could still go ahead and make the appointment even if the Select Committee was opposed to it. That did actually happen with the Education Committee and the Children's Commissioner in the last Parliament. I think in practice, if a Select Committee were to reject a particular candidate, it would be very difficult for the government to go ahead, particularly with an appointment as important as the Chairman of the Trust.
Now, of course, one of the things that did come up is the fact that Lord Patten is a former chairman of the Tory party,
Yeah.
and one of your colleagues pointed out that perhaps if the future government is a Labour one and they appoint Lord Mandelson as chairman of the BBC, I think that's a point you made yourself. How do you feel about that? Because as a chairman of a party, you're pumping out propaganda.
Yeah.
Chairman of the BBC, you're fighting it.
The problem is that Chris Patten is an impressive candidate, and I don't think anybody really thinks he's going to try and use it for political ends. But of course, it does establish a precedent. I mean, it would be silly in a way to require Chris Patten to resign his membership, because he's not going to stop being a Conservative. But it's clearly very important that he should play no part in current politics.
Now, we talked about the principle of it. What was the outcome in your view?
Chris Patten is a very experienced and polished performer, and I think most of us went away reassured on a lot of the points that we raised with him. I don't expect that Chris Patten will be a devotee of Six Music and Radio 1.
He declared his love for Melvyn Bragg and for Radio 4, and declared his almost total ignorance of a lot of popular programming.
I mean, there's no point in Chris Patten pretending to be sort of trendy when he's not. But I hope that he will want to sample and become a viewer and listener to all of the BBC's output.
And finally, when will we know who the new chairman is?
Our report will be published on Saturday mornings. That, of course, goes to the Prime Minister, and it's then up to the Prime Minister whether or not he confirms Lord Patten as the new chairman. But I would imagine that he will reach a decision quite quickly.
So that sounds a bit like a shoo-in, and of course those of people listening to our Sunday repeat will know what the answer is. John Whittingdale, thank you very much. Are you impressed by this new democratic invention? Or did you think Parliament's approval of Lord Patten's appointment was a formality? And what do you think his priorities should be? And we'll be speaking to the outgoing chairman of the BBC Trust, Sir Michael Lyons, the week after next. Now, from principles to programmes. We had a big response to last week's feedback investigation of the way music is used under, or should that be over, speech. Stella Ashley pretty much sums up your views, calling such use of music intrusive, unnecessary and damned irritating. Only one person stood out against this chorus of disapproval.
Hello, I'm Keith Wilkinson. I'm one of the ageing audiences whose hearing's declining, so I listened with some sympathy to the debate about mixing music and speech, but I didn't have much sympathy for the extremists who are calling for no music at all. For example, last week's soul music about Mozart's clarinet concerto, with a beautiful slow movement playing very quietly underneath the words, but just occasionally pushed up a bit louder to punctuate the words. And I thought anybody who could listen to that and stay unmoved must be really hard-hearted. And it worked so well precisely because of the juxtaposition of words and music.
1. Satisfied customer. 1. There are few areas of activity which are not being affected by the cuts in public expenditure. Or is that savings? Well, number 10 might be listening. Certainly not the BBC World Service, which has announced the end of some of its services. Carolyn Andrews emailed feedback@bbc.co.uk to say how much she'll miss programmes for the Caribbean, and indeed elsewhere. The BBC is the only source of information for a great deal of the world, she says. Ian Carter is less convinced of the value of the World Service. Ian asks, how many of the people who pay for it actually listen to it? Well, when it comes to the 11 million who listen to the BBC Hindi service in India, they don't pay for it, but they love it. The service was due to stop broadcasting on shortwave at the end of this month, but now a number of offers have come forward from the private sector to help provide alternative funding which could keep the Hindi service going. Much to the delight of listener Ashok Pandey, who lives in the state of Madhya Pradesh. He told us on a rather poor phone line how pleased he was to hear the news.
Yes, I am very pleased. It is important to me because I basically belong to rural areas. In a rural area, there is no other source of media or information. BBC plays a vital role for us as source of knowledge.
Sorry about the poor quality of that sound. The editor of the BBC Hindi service, Amit Barua, explained a bit more about the possible change of plan.
We have been approached by several commercial parties, so we've decided to keep this service going for a limited period of time so that we can explore these options. And many of our listeners have reacted very positively to this decision that we have decided to continue even 1 hour. And I'll share with you some of the responses that have come. There's Anurag Tiwari who writes from Ahmedabad. Dear BBC, it's heartening to know that the Hindi service is not going to stop. 1 bulletin in a day would be fine. I do not have words, but I'm very happy. I do not know what made this possible, but thanks to God and to the management for considering the requests of millions of listeners. Now I hope and believe that in the given time, BBC may find many funding avenues. Then there's Hemant Dinkar, who's writing, I'm very happy to know that you decided to keep your service on. This is the best news of 2011 so far. So those are the kinds of responses that have come, from listeners after this announcement was made to keep 1 hour of programming going for an interim period of 1 year till March 2012.
Amit Barua. So, could private finance save the Hindi service? We should know by next March. Only 12 months to wait. And would such private assistance affect the service's real or perceived independence? I'm sure you'll let us know. But it's not all cuts here at the savings here at the BBC. When it comes to programmes, there's more, not less. 4 extra for a start. Except that it's not that extra, since it used to be called BBC 7. So what's really new? Tim Davies, the BBC's head of audio and music. I asked him what 4 Extra will launch with.
Primarily, most of the programming will be recognisable to a Radio 7 audience because the majority of 4 Extra will remain the archive. What you will notice is we'll see things like News Quiz Extra, so half an hour on Radio 4, but we record a lot more than we can air, so we'll have extended versions of programmes such as that. We'll also have a family hour. We're also, with CBeebies, doing 20 minutes of downloadable audio, which sounds horrible in some ways, but essentially is 20 minutes of CBeebies audio that you can listen to from any computer or take on a device and put on your car. I think we're hedging our bets in some ways. I'm certainly not giving up on broadcasting radio that children will enjoy. So I think, if I said a drama like The Silver Sword, which is a great children's novel, which we'll be doing on 4 Extra, I certainly want children to still enjoy the pleasure of live radio. But I do think anyone with young children like myself knows that to get them to sit down and listen to radio, it would be nice to have some CBeebies audio that they can take into the car, for instance.
We'll hear more from Tim Davie later in Feedback when he extols the digital future. And I try to get him to tell me what he really thinks about the 2015 digital switchover or analogue switch off. But before that, and there is no connection with the previous item, an unhappy ending. Last Wednesday night, listener Rosemary Britton was settling down to enjoy the 6th and final episode of Mawdryn MacDonald, 21st Century Wizard.
And now, in the last of the present series, our wizard hero Mawdryn MacDonald prepares for a visit from Merlin.
Ages come and go.
This late-night Radio 4 comedy details the life and times of a 2,000-year-old wizard living in the 21st century. I know how he feels.
If a tree falls in the woods, clearly there's woodworm or dry rot involved.
Episode 2.
Episode 2? Suddenly Rosemary Britton was transported magically back through the swirling mists of time to February the 2nd.
If a tree falls in the woods, clearly there's woodworm or dry rot involved.
Episode 2.
Oh dear. The time-travelling Rosemary Britton was just one of those who emailed feedback.
I was annoyed when the wrong episode was aired. This seems to happen regularly, and there's no apology or information if the programme is going to be rebroadcast.
So what happened? The BBC issued a statement, delivered by winged monkeys, of course.
Unfortunately, the wrong episode of Mordred MacDonald was played out, and we apologise to listeners. The full series will be repeated later this year.
Well, at least everything isn't automated. There's still room for good old human error. I don't know if we can wait until later in the year to find out what happened. If you fancy writing your own ending, get in touch. I'd also like to hear your thoughts on anything you've heard on BBC Radio this week.
You can write to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London W1A 1QT, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could be more on some mobile networks. Contact details are on the feedback pages of the Radio 4 website, or simply email feedback@bbc.co.uk.
Lots of you have been in touch in response to recent announcements which claim that there have been significant improvements in digital radio coverage and reception.
Hello, this is Peter Hebbard. 90% of the country will be covered by the end of the year. That means 8% of us still won't be. Come on, BBC engineers, surely you can do better than this. Longwave has covered the whole country for nearly a century.
I'm David Brinicum. I bought a digital radio for my car, and the salesman said, they don't work in Devon, but I bought it anyway. I was a bit of an optimist, and sure enough, it didn't work.
My name is Dan Foote from Downderry in Cornwall. From 2015, FM will be switched off, and we will have no wireless coverage whatsoever in this area.
But despite that, as Tim Davie, the BBC's head of audio and music, told me this week, encouraged by Whitehall, the BBC is pressing ahead with its attempts to get all of us to switch over to digital. Well, nearly all of us. Obviously, poor old Daniel Foote isn't part of the big picture.
Well, let's be very clear. The BBC would not endorse a switchover unless DAB distribution pretty well exactly matched FM.
Yeah, but Daniel says Ofcom have told him there are no plans to give our little area of Cornwall, only 9 miles from Plymouth, DAB coverage.
FM, as I understand it, covers about 98 to 99% of the country. We have said we want to build DAB to that equivalent.
By the way, Daniel can get FM.
Right. Now, very specifically, he may have a point. We'll cover 97% of the population. So there will be a very, very small minority of people, just as there are with FM. Now, at that point, you say internet radios, you say what other devices. We currently have radio on Freeview, on television, Sky. All of those options, or on satellite, absolutely, Sky, FreeSat.
Can you hold out any hope that those people who get an imperfect reception on their DAB receiver, that it will improve?
Will there be improvements? The answer is yes, because there's more transmitters going up. But at the moment, we don't have full coverage in terms of distribution, so people get the signal's not as good as FM. That is improving. Recent research in cars said 3/4 of the people are getting a good signal now. So you begin to see a point at which this can really happen.
It may happen, but when you look at the statistics which we've got here, which tell us that, for example, 20% of listening to radio goes on in cars, only 2% of cars have digital radios. Well, that's a long, long way from 100%, isn't it?
It's miles from 100%, and absolutely there is a long road to go for the car industry.
Because if every new car from this summer, let's say every new car has digital radio. People have got old cars with radios they won't want to throw away or won't have to renew. So although the problem will diminish as you go forward, it'll take a while, won't it? Again, not by 2050.
I expect there'll be there has to be very low cost devices to transform an old radio into a digital receiver. There has to be an offer where people say, I would really like 4 extra in the car, I'd quite like a digital radio. Now, that is how the radio industry will achieve a switchover.
When you were last on Feedback in November, you refused to say when we'd all go digital. Can you again give us a date when you are confident that let's say 95% of the people in this country will get a digital signal which is as good as the analogue signal they get at the moment?
Well, by the end of 2011, our target is to reach 93% of the population with a robust DAB signal.
But there are some of our listeners, Tim Davie, who will never be persuaded that you can get as good a quality of sound from DAB that you can get analogue. Martin Brown, for example, said the problem isn't poor reception, it is poor audio quality.
In our research, the appreciation and approval of the radio signal is much the same between DAB and FM. Now, I know there are people out there who will get very grumpy when I say that, frankly, because they believe that FM is a better, deeper sound. I have to say, one of the things, if you're listening at home, that I would consider, if you're really interested in sound quality, is go to the Radio 3 website now, and you'll see I'm offering something called HD Sound. Because if you want full dynamic range, the internet and the satellite signals give you better quality.
Can I ask you one thing which affects our listeners in Scotland? Pete McKimmie, for example, in Aberdeen, Scotland, says, I notice Radio 4 has kept very quiet about the upcoming loss of the only reliable digital radio service in Scotland, which he says is Freeview. And he says the BBC Trust has decided to remove all the BBC's radio services from Freeview in Scotland in order to squeeze in the BBC Alba TV channel.
I can offer a bit of comfort here. We would prioritise Alba in the evening, but I'm not giving up on looking for creative ways in which I could find a bit of spare spectrum. I don't want to get people's hopes up, because we may decide to go, for instance, for the digital channels that aren't distributed elsewhere.
But isn't the realpolitik of this that the government has decided there has to be DAB broadcasting for a variety of reasons, and perhaps one of them is to sell off the areas in the spectrum that will be freed, and the BBC is being used as an instrument of public policy here?
I don't buy that for a minute, actually. I think the BBC is interested in growing the benefits of digital. And this isn't a mad charge to, sell radios. This is my belief, actually, that in the future, radio being the only analogue media where we don't allow people to catch up, we're not properly represented on the internet, we don't have good services on 4Extra, and better, me being able to offer Desert Island Disc with archives, with extended versions, there is no downside to Radio 4 listeners in this. It is extra programming and the ability to explore what you love. I think radio should benefit from digital.
Tim Davey. Jane Marshall is a producer who specialises in readings for Radios 3 and 4. She was responsible for the recent book of the week, The Sun Hasn't Fallen from the Sky, which was a big hit with many feedback listeners. In her time, she has worked with such lofty talents as Sir Ben Kingsley, no less. But finding the right leading man for her latest production presented her with something of a problem. The book is called Pigeon English, and it's the first novel by writer Stephen Kellman.
I get sent an enormous number of books to read for book at bedtime, and this was one of those books that came in the post in the morning, and I was still sitting there at lunchtime reading it. And it's really the story of how an 11-year-old switches cultures and learns to get on in London after living in a town in Ghana. The main character is Harrison, called Harry for short. He's an 11-year-old boy, loves to run fast, very fond of his mum. He's got an older sister and a baby sister, and he has to learn how to become streetwise very quickly. It is a very distinctive boy. You're hearing the thoughts in this boy's head. It's all in the first person. And so we decided we wouldn't go ahead with this book unless we could find the right boy. I started off contacting some of the well-known stage schools, but to get specifically a Ghanaian child of the right age was obviously going to be a task. And eventually I started ringing around some of the schools.
Jojo, where are you off to? I think I'm off to science now, or either DT. My name is Jojo Baidu, and I'm in Year 8, Enfield Grammar School. Jane Marshall came to the school looking for someone to do her story for her. I offered to do it, and she thought that my voice was the best for the job.
I didn't want him to take it on unless I was confident it would be a good experience for him and that he could be successful at it. And eventually I found a voice coach, and I said to her, let's have a talk after you've done the 3 sessions and tell me if I'm absolutely mad or whether you think Jojo absolutely has something special. And after the first session, she was ringing me up saying, yes, he's brilliant, go for it.
He was waiting for if the killer came back.
He was waiting for if the killer came back. You're explaining it to them.
He was waiting for if the killer came back. They teach you how to do different sounds, like how to project your voice as well, and when you have to put different emotions into it. You could see the chains hanging from his belt.
Just go back on that. You could see the chains.
You could see the chains hanging from his belt. You couldn't see the gun. You couldn't see the gun. My favourite memory was when I first got to the studio, because it was a really different experience. I'd never seen a studio before. There was a few microphones there, computers, pianos for musicians. It was amazing.
It's a huge ask for a child of 11 or 12 to sustain a reading over 10, 13-and-a-half-minute episodes. It's difficult enough for experienced actors. It's a real skill, although it sounds as if it's going to be a very easy thing to do.
Right. I think we've got that. So that bit we don't have to worry about ever again.
Oh, that's good.
It is. It's a nice feeling of progress as you get through.
Yeah.
You do bit by bit. You've read that how many times now? Hundreds?
7 or 6 or 8.
And I know you practiced.
He had a different mentality from what I would have had. But, like, at different points, there were different type of emotions, like sad, angry, happy, joyful, and scared at times, yeah. So I know all those emotions, so I just put them into play, like how I would feel if I was scared, how I would feel if I was happy or angry. For our reward, he gave us a big bottle of Fanta. We had a drinking race, and then we all had a big burp together, like bullfrogs having a ruckus. If I'm given the opportunity, I would like to do different things on radio. I have different ideas. Yeah, at a point I wanted to be a doctor, a singer, astronaut, everything. But I'll get my mind clear someday.
That was Jojo Beidou, who has been reading Stephen Kelman's Pidgin English, Radio 4's book at bedtime, which runs until Friday, the 18th of March. If you've missed them or want to listen again, the first 5 episodes are now on iPlayer. Next week on Feedback, I'll be talking to Andy Parfitt, the controller of BBC Radio 1 and 1 Extra. Do let me know if you have any questions for him, otherwise my daughters will be conducting the interview. But just before we go, did you know In Our Time this week celebrated its 500th edition? Melvyn and his guests marked the occasion by discussing the concept of free will, as in, does the controller of Radio 4 have any choice but to recommission the series? Lindy Platten-Jarvis thought of another way to mark the auspicious anniversary.
To celebrate the 500th programme of In Our Time, will we expect Melvyn Bragg to slip off an icy roof in the dark, windy night?
The roof wouldn't dare. I'm off to see Melvyn's only real rival in the broadcasting and literary world, Berkhamsted's answer to the Sage of Cumberland, Ed Reardon. Tomorrow he is opening an Oxfam bookshop there, and is asked for a little help with his speech, which at the moment is around 90 minutes long. So, only 89 minutes to cut. Goodbye. If she'd been impressed by what had been a unique occasion.
I think between them they covered every important issue, and I thought he came through it with flying colours. It's added to the transparency, it's made the candidate think things through, and it has revealed the character of the person in public, which has probably not been apparent before.
But he made absolutely clear that no more salami slicing in the BBC, cutting small bits from existing services. He's clearly in the business about cutting back and taking out some services, doing less better. Nobody said anything about consulting the audience about what should be cut.
It's going to be very, very difficult, and he recognises the difficulties. Whatever they cut, there will be an out.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Are you sitting comfortably, ready for your digital exam? Question 1. What percentage of listening to radio is done in the car? Answer: 20%. How many cars are fitted with a digital radio? Answer: 2%. Question 3. Does anyone seriously believe that the government's target date of 2015 for switching off all non-digital network radio is remotely feasible? Later in Feedback, I'll try and find out if the boss of BBC Radio is a true digital believer. And what about his ultimate boss, the likely incoming chairman of the BBC Trust, Lord Patten, whose proposed appointment was scrutinised by Parliament this week?
It would be a huge honour to help steer the BBC from the analogue to the digital age.
Just over 12 years ago, Lord Patten, as the last governor, was handing Hong Kong over to the Chinese. Schoolboy Jojo Beidou wasn't even born then, but now he's playing the lead in this week's Book at Bedtime on Radio 4.
For our reward, he gave us a big bottle of Fanta. We had a drinking race, and then we all had a big burp together, like bullfrogs having a ruckus.
But first, a first. Before Lord Patten could take up his latest appointment as chairman of the BBC Trust, he had to gain the approval of the Parliamentary Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. So they asked him to come along and be grilled. Would
cry. I mean, we're very disturbed at the moment about the impact on the World Service, and it seems so short-sighted, as indeed we were about Six Music.
But obviously for people listening to this programme, one of the things they'll be concerned about is the danger that Tris Patten and Mark Thompson of the BBC takes his decisions in private and then tells the listener and the viewer after it's made them.
But he did mention the interests of licence fee payers, which I think is important, and which the government to an extent has forgotten in using some of the licence fee now to fund services that were previously funded by government. And he also recognised the difficulty that's going to come, for instance, when one service like the World Service is pitted against another, one of the domestic services.
Yes, you'll have to be deciding to cut, perhaps. Do you be toast or toasted?
You're paid £110,000 a year for this job. Do you think you're worth it?
What will you be doing to tackle perceived bias in BBC reporting?
Everything I read about your desire for this job had the word passion. You were passionate about it. And whilst we all demonstrate passion differently, I have to say I'm not getting the passion. The only passion you've demonstrated this morning is a strange passion for Melvyn Bragg.
The hearing lasted just over 2 hours, in which we found out, among other things, that Lord Patten is a great fan of Radio 3, Melvyn Bragg and Radio 4, with which he says he wakes up and goes to bed. He also made clear there would be tough cuts to come. Afterwards, I asked Jocelyn Hay, who runs The Independent, the very independent public service lobby group Voice of the Listener and Viewer,